Welcome to POTUS 2016, where we call the presidential horse race and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Remember the loyalty oath that all 16 GOP candidates signed back in September, promising to support whoever gets the nomination? Well, it's expired. On a CNN forum Tuesday night, Donald Trump refused to say he would back the party's choice if it isn't him. Ted Cruz evaded the question by predicting Trump wouldn't get the nomination anyway, and John Kasich said he couldn't support a person who was, quote, really hurting and dividing the country. Now, who might he have in mind? In advance of the Wisconsin primary next Tuesday, Kasich continued to resist calls that he drop out of the race. We'll take a close look at Governor Kasich and his strategy and his legacy in Ohio in a few minutes. Of course, the Trump campaign had its usual torrent of press coverage this past week. Precious little of it was about public policy. Trump's campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, was charged with misdemeanor battery for allegedly manhandling ex-Breitbart reporter Michelle Fields at a news conference. Trump defended him and pointed out that she was holding a pen, which can be dangerous. He's right. It can be mightier than the sword. And after a pro-Cruz super PAC put ads on social media featuring nude pictures of Trump's wife, captioned, "Meet Melania, your next First Lady," these were from British GQ magazine 16 years ago, the Donald retaliated, retweeting a picture of Cruz's wife, Heidi, who is quite accomplished but never a model. On the less racy Democratic side, Bernie Sanders bounced back from losses in Ohio and the South. This past weekend, he routed Hillary Clinton by winning 70 to 80% of the vote in 3 Democratic caucuses, Washington State, Hawaii, and Alaska. Bernie now thinks he has a path to the nomination and challenged Hillary to a debate in delegate-rich New York, which holds its primary on April 19th. Hillary said she's not against a Brooklyn debate. With so much mud flying, can we make out who's ahead? Yes, time for the horse race. As we noted, Bernie Sanders and his supporters had a great week. He narrowed the gap with Hillary Clinton to 263 elected delegates with those 3 wins on Saturday. But if he is to achieve what many think is impossible, there would need to be a sea change still. Sanders would need to win in big prize states like New York, plus Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland, where Hillary Clinton currently leads in the polls, and often by a sizable margin. Any failure to win most of the delegates in those states would be a major setback. Bernie would also have to outperform current expectations in many medium-sized states, and only if all of this happens, superdelegates could start to defect from Hillary, allowing for him to actually catch up. State-by-state polling indicates that Clinton is gaining even more ground and could double her current lead in elected delegates. Her solid appeal among Hispanics and African Americans, and the simple fact that Democratic races award delegates proportionally do not add up well for a Sanders catch-up. But we'll see. Now to the Republicans. Up until now, Donald Trump's support has been steadfast among his own supporters. Surveys say his support is solid, especially among people who fit these descriptions: those who didn't attend college, folks who feel they lack a voice in society, individuals wary of outsiders, people who tend to support authoritarian leaders and policies, and many who reside in areas of the country that possess a higher than average rate of racial resentment. But as strong and unwavering as Donald's supporters might be, Trump has also succeeded in alienating the majority of the electorate, women. Anti-Trump Republicans capitalized on this sentiment in a recent ad by the anti-Trump group, Our Principles PAC.
Bimbo.
Dog.
Fat pig.
Real quotes from Donald Trump about women.
A person who is very flat-chested is very hard to be a 10.
I'd look her right in that fat, ugly face of hers.
Look at that face. Would anyone vote for that?
She had the height, she had the beauty. She was crazy. But these are minor details.
I like kids. I mean, I won't do anything to take care of them. I'll supply funds, and she'll take care of the kids.
You know, it really doesn't matter what they write, as long as you've got a young and beautiful piece of ass.
That must be a pretty picture, you dropping to your knees.
There was blood coming out of her eyes. Blood coming out of her wherever.
Women. You have to treat them like
This is how Donald Trump talks about our mothers, our sisters,
our daughters.
If you believe America deserves better, vote against Donald Trump.
According to an NBC News, Wall Street Journal national poll released earlier this month, almost half, 47% of Republican women cannot see themselves supporting Donald Trump, a negative rating that skyrockets to 70% among all female voters. In further bad news for the frontrunner, Trump's overall favorability rating has continued to drop right when he needs every delegate between now and early June to secure the nomination. According to Huffington Post polling averages, in the last 2 months, Donald Trump's favorable rating, shown by that bottom line, dropped about 7 percentage points. This was accompanied by a near 6-point rise in those with an unfavorable view, the red line above. With the field narrowed to just 2 candidates in reach of a delegate majority before the convention, never-Trump Republicans have been focusing on flipping unbound delegates in favor of Cruz and unleashing a spate of negative advertising targeting Trump's reputation. But according to David Wasserman, writing for the poll watchers over at 538, a more coordinated effort by candidates John Kasich and Ted Cruz could be the best and last hope for the GOP in stopping Trump. In remaining primary states, where delegates are awarded proportionally, like New York, Rhode Island, New Mexico, Oregon, and Washington, a race that included John Kasich would probably help deny delegates to Trump. But in winner-take-all states, and states where Kasich is in danger of not meeting the minimum delegate threshold of 15%, Kasich might help out most by stepping aside. All right, as promised, time to focus on John Kasich. He's the governor of Ohio, 9-term congressman, former Fox News commentator, and one-time investment banker at Lehman Brothers. Kasich cannot win the GOP nomination outright before the convention. That is a statistical impossibility. But he says he remains in the race as a moderate alternative that the GOP can turn to in a deadlock convention. And he claims that unlike him, both Trump and Cruz would lose to Clinton in the general election if she is the nominee. Compared to Trump and Cruz, Kasich does look moderate, at least in his demeanor. This is from the final minutes of Tuesday's town hall in Milwaukee.
The spirit of our country, Anderson, doesn't rest in the president. I mean, the president's important. But the spirit of our country rests in the neighborhoods. It rests in the people who are here tonight. We're the ones that need to change the world. We're the ones that need to fix education, deal with the problems of the poor. You know, one of the things I've said is you take a lady who's, was married 50 years, her husband dies, nobody calls her anymore. Call her on a Monday. What does she do on a Thursday? She gets her hair done. Then when Saturday comes, when you're going to take her to dinner, somehow not one hair is out of place. When you pick her up, she wears a dress she hadn't worn in 6 months. Are you changing the world? I think you are. When a nurse spends an extra 15 minutes with a family that's in trouble and says things are going to be okay, Anderson, I just happen to believe that, I don't want to get too carried away here, but, the Lord's given us all a certain purpose in life, and we need to carry it out. And we need to live a life bigger than ourselves.
But is John Kasich always as warm and thoughtful as he appears there? And where exactly does he stand on the issues? Ohioans know him best, including reporter Jo Ingles with Ohio Public TV and Radio. She joins us via Skype from Columbus. Hi, Jo.
Hi, Brian.
So in terms of tone, first, what we just saw, what America's been seeing, is this the John Kasich Ohioans know?
Sometimes. He can be warm and fuzzy and say things like that. But he also has a side of him where he can be brash, and he can actually be rude at times. He's had to apologize over some things he's said here in Ohio because they have been out of place, and he's admitted it later.
What's an example of that? You have one top of mind?
Yes, I do. Well, shortly after being elected, he was speaking with some state employees, and he called a police officer who had pulled him over a few years before that. He called him an idiot.
I had this idiot pull me over on 315. Listen to this story. He says to me, he says, you passed this emergency vehicle on the side of the road and you didn't yield. I didn't, officer, what are you kidding? I didn't see any. I don't even see where the heck was it? The last thing I would ever do would be to pass an emergency. Are you kidding me? He says, well, I understand that. Give me your license. Goes back to the car, comes back, gives me a ticket, says you must report to court. If you don't report to court, we're putting a warrant out for your arrest. He's an idiot. We just can't act that way. And what people resent are people who are in the government who don't treat the client with respect. Maybe that's another thing we have to think about, right?
That's such an interesting clip to me as someone who doesn't know Kasich very well. Because on the one hand, it's kind of Trump-like, calling somebody an idiot like that and just using that word as, you know, a high government official. But on the other hand, he's making a very humble point in a way at the end of it, which is that all public employees, not just this guy as an idiot, all public employees should act humbly to the public.
Yes, he's making both points. You're absolutely right. He later, after that clip you just showed came out, someone got the actual tape from the stop, and they were able to see that all of the other cars did see to pull over into the next lane, and that Governor Kasich, who was then not the governor, didn't pull over. He came back and he apologized, and he was very good about apologizing. He went directly to the police and apologized, and also apologized statewide. But this isn't the only time he's done this. I mean, Governor Kasich has a brash side of him. He also has a very tender side of him, and he often, like you referenced at the top, talks about the Lord and his religious leanings when he's talking about state policy, especially when he's dealing with issues like expansion of Medicaid and services for the poor. He will talk about the Lord and the calling that he has to deal with those issues.
All right, let's talk about policy. Does he have a signature policy like some people have associated with them?
Well, expansion of Medicaid is a huge signature policy for him because that was a very tough decision for him to make. A lot of the Republicans statewide did not want him to expand the Medicaid and go into
that was the Obamacare Medicaid expansion to people with a little higher incomes than under the old Medicaid system, but each governor could decide for him or herself, and most Republican governors turned it down.
Most Republican governors turned it down, not Governor Kasich. He did take that, but he didn't. The state did not set up its own exchange like several other states did. So we're still working off the federal exchange here. But he was highly criticized for that move.
How about with respect to public employees? I've read that he has a Scott Walker from Wisconsin kind of reputation with respect to trying to ending collective bargaining for public employees in the state, but he doesn't get as much national publicity for it as Scott Walker does. How true?
That's true. Back in the early part of his career as governor, he had signed something called Senate Bill 5. Now that took away collective bargaining rights for teachers, for firefighters, police officers, a whole array of state employees. And when he signed it, there was a complete outroar. And immediately all of the unions got together. They started, fighting it on a big front, even after he signed it. And they raised a lot of money. In the end, they were able to take it to the ballot statewide, and they repealed it by a 2-to-1 margin.
We played that clip of a commercial against Trump of women reciting offensive things with respect to women that Trump has said. Does Kasich have a little bit of a reputation in this category?
Governor Kasich is perceived by a lot of women's groups as having a very heavy hand, especially by women's groups that are supportive of abortion rights. Under Governor Kasich's administration, there have been at least 16 changes to abortion law in Ohio. Some of those have come from outright laws that were passed and signed. Others have been rules, changes in state agencies and the way that they deal with the abortion issue. Most recently, Ohio passed a law, the legislature, our Republican legislature, both the House and Senate, They passed a law that took away $1.4 million. These are federal dollars from Planned Parenthood, and that money is to be used for birth control and those kinds of healthcare situations. That was taken away, and it was all that money is now set to go to community health centers. Now, the people who are against this move, the women who are against it, say that there's really a problem here in that a lot of these centers that were identified are things like dental clinics and places that would not be able to help with birth control or any kind of cancer screening.
Now, that's all at the policy level, and people will have whatever opinions they have about abortion rights and contraception and those issues. The Trump ad, the anti-Trump ad, was about things that he said about particular women or women in general. And I have a Kasich quote here, and tell me if this is consistent with his reputation or if it's a one-off or what. But from 2010, shortly after winning the governor's job, he said that his family has a system where he gets to make all the big decisions while he leaves all the little stuff to his wife, Karen. Quote, my wife makes all the minor decisions about where we live, what we eat, where we go, where we vacation, and what we do on a daily basis. So she's in charge of the family, and she's done a fantastic job. I don't know if where we live and what we eat are such little decisions, but was he being sarcastic or dismissive or sexist, or what's the real context for that?
He said that to a group of reporters. They were asking him about, different things. And he said, basically those are her decisions, to make those kind of decisions about what they do. And I think maybe that came out when he announced that he wasn't going to live in the governor's mansion and he wanted to live in his nearby home in Columbus. If I'm remembering right, that's what he's answering to. But at any rate, he has a reputation of talking about women in a way sometimes that, like the little woman, So there is a Trump-like aspect to it, but he's never been as far off as Trump has as far as making comments about someone being ugly, or at least none that I've heard. And
briefly, how about the role of government in Ohioans' lives? Some people will remember that he was the budget hawk for Newt Gingrich when the Gingrich Revolution was going on in Congress in the 90s, and Kasich was in Congress. And I understand that in Ohio he has passed some what are widely considered regressive tax changes. So what's his reputation there, and what's one or two of the specifics?
Well, he would call it tax cuts. He would say he's cut taxes for Ohioans, and indeed he has in some places. He has cut income taxes significantly, and those affect people who make the most money, let's be real, and they're not paying as much. But that has all been passed on, and who is paying more is the little guy, because the sales tax has gone up. And so now we pay more in sales taxes. There were fees that were raised, so people pay more in fees. Yeah. And also, you see that the local government's fund had been cut. And that was the money the state gave local communities to operate their emergency forces and schools. And because of that, a lot of local taxes went up to compensate.
So as most of the media obsesses on Donald Trump, we've hardly gotten to learn the pros and cons and nuances of John Kasich's policies, even though he's one of only three Republicans still standing in the race. So Jo Ingles from Ohio Public Radio and Television, thank you so much for filling us in.
Thank you, Brian.
Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Wisconsin has Democratic and Republican primaries next Tuesday, April 5th. One dramatic shift that we've seen in Wisconsin is the strength of unions. 5 years ago this June, Republican Governor Scott Walker signed the very controversial Wisconsin Act 10, limiting collective bargaining rights for public employees. And early last year, he signed another anti-union law, making Wisconsin a right-to-work state in the private sector. What does that mean? Well, right-to-work laws allow employees to opt out of unions or paying union dues, even while reaping the benefits. 25 states now have them. Wisconsin's resistance to unions began as a budgetary effort in the face of public deficits, but is the overall effect on the state's economy positive? A study published early last year casts doubts. Joining us via Skype from Milwaukee is Abdur Chowdhury. He's a professor of economics at Marquette University and former chief economist to the UN Commission in Europe. His study is called The Potential Effects of a Right-to-Work Law in Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us, Professor. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me on your program.
If you're looking at the potential effects on the economy in Wisconsin, how do you, as a social scientist, measure that?
Basically, what I have done is, obviously, we have to sort of analyze what will happen. So what I did was I looked at evidence from the previous 24 states that did have right-to-work legislation passed. And then based on that, based on a number of studies that were done, looking at those states, I came up with some numbers and calculated what effect this is going to have on Wisconsin.
So let's look briefly at some of the states that you studied. Oklahoma is one, right?
Yes. Yeah. Oklahoma had the right-to-work legislation passed back in 2001. So it had about 14 years of history. Based on evidence from Oklahoma, what we found was that right to work did have some adverse impact on the economy, especially in terms of wages. We did see some increase in employment compared to, let's say, collective bargaining states, but wages did go down. And because wages went down, so we did a sort of a counterfactual study for Wisconsin and see what effect that might have in Wisconsin.
Why would wages go, I mean, I understand why wages would go down if there's less ability to have unions empowered to bargain for people. Why would the number of jobs go up?
The number of jobs went up because what happened in those states is that business firms, especially small business firms, they felt that they now could increase their employment. And since labor union was not as powerful as before, so they were able to hire people at a slightly lower wages than they paid before. So they hired more people, but paid them less.
But you project that the number of jobs would go down in Wisconsin with right to work, unlike Oklahoma?
No. In Wisconsin, I'm also projecting that there will be a slight increase in the number of jobs, but wages will drop.
I see. And you list a rise in inequality as one impact of right to work. Why that?
What we have seen from other states is that basically the wage drop that we have seen, it affected minorities and women workers more. So taking that into effect, we did see there may be an increase in inequality if the same trend continues.
We mentioned Oklahoma. What other state is a good example?
There are two recent cases, but they're, I think, too early. Michigan and Illinois, they had the right-to-work legislation passed in 2012, but we don't have enough information from those two states.
Why is this such a political agenda item for the right or for employers?
It's basically what I found, my evidence is that right to work by itself does not help to attract new businesses. Now, that was one of the main arguments for right to work, that if a state has a right to work legislation, it will help to attract new businesses. What I found was that that's not the case. When a new business decides to come to a certain state, they simply don't look at whether the state has right to work law or not. They look at the entire business environment. They look at what's the tax laws, for example. What's the incentive that the state governments are providing? What's the overall business environment in that state? So they look at the entire package and not just one single legislation.
And we just have 20 seconds left, but do employees really take advantage of that option? In other words, if they're going to work in a union workplace, do they really opt out of paying the union dues even though they're getting the benefit? It's like stealing.
Yes, what we have seen in other states is that's not the case. In fact, union membership has dropped significantly in Wisconsin over the last decade. And so we don't see that non-union members get too much of an advantage through this right to legislation.
People don't have to pay, they don't pay. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you for having me on your program. Thank you.
And finally, some critical words from our current president about the tone of this year's campaign. This came as he spoke before a group at the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting, given by the Newhouse School at Syracuse University. The late Robin Toner was a much-honored political reporter for the New York Times.
I know I'm not the only one who may be more than a little dismayed about what's happening on the campaign trail right now. The divisive and often vulgar rhetoric that's aimed at everybody, but often is focused on the vulnerable or women or minorities. The sometimes well-intentioned, but I think misguided attempts to shut down that speech. The violent reaction that we see, as well as the deafening silence from too many of our leaders in the coarsening of the debate. The sense that facts don't matter, that they're not relevant, that what matters is how much attention you can generate. The sense that this is a game, as opposed to the most precious gift our founders gave us, this collective enterprise of self-government.
By the way, the winner of the Toner Prize for 2015 was Alec McGillis at ProPublica. He won for stories that revealed the influence of oil companies and other corporations on public policy and why some voters seem to make political choices against their own interests. And that's POTUS 2016 for today. We're here each week at this hour. Next time, the results from Wisconsin and Wyoming and a conversation with Orrin Cass. He was an advisor to the Mitt Romney campaign. Where does this thoughtful Republican stand now? Join us then. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.